The exhibition's organised pretty much chronologically. So we start here with paintings from the 1950s. This was the decade when Alfred had just won his travelling fellowship and had arrived in Europe and went straight to Paris, enrolled in the Académie de la Grande Chaumière. I think that's the studio he's painting here. And you can see in these pictures he's painting very much in a French style, really. This picture of the tugboats is very impressionist looking, the way he's dealing with the ripples in the water and the way the light falls on that, the way the light comes in through the studio window in the big studio picture. He'd done a lot of portrait painting as well, and in the first painting here you can see a portrait of his friend, the painter Reggie Weston, as the rabbi from Dublin. Reggie wasn't a rabbi and he wasn't from Dublin, but they borrowed a top hat and thought it would make a good portrait. Done in a more expressionist style, perhaps. He'd set up a portrait studio with some friends in the Art Institute in Chicago, and they painted a lot of actors and band leaders and people like that. And he carried on doing wonderful portraits, very expressive, all through the 50s. But then later on in the 50s, he started going outdoors more, and particularly visiting the French coast of Normandy and Brittany, and painting scenes like this. This is the port called L'Orient, seen from Port Louis at night. And you can see things beginning to change. It doesn't look as impressionist in its treatment. It's got more abstract. If you look closely at it, you can see that there are these sort of little squares of paint, little pockets of colour, and that's how it's structured. That movement was known as tachism in France, a tache being a sort of pocket or a splotch of colour. It was very much the European equivalent of abstract expressionism, and it's at this point I think Alfred, although he never became a fully abstract painter like Rothko or someone, nonetheless he was aware of what they were doing and he was interested in experimenting with abstraction, and his work changes very dramatically towards the end of the 1950s. In the second section here, Alfred has moved to London. He arrived in 1960. And it's when he got here, I think, that his work really changed in a spectacular way. We hung this picture of one of his early studios in London, in Gordon Place in Kensington, opposite the picture of the French studio for comparison. And you can see that by the time he's painting this one, it's become, again, much more abstract. The colours are almost monochrome, very boldly structured. And then with this square or rectangle of very bright light at the centre, pulling it all together. He said he walked out one morning from the first studio he had in London, which was in Chelsea, and looked at the Thames in the dawn and decided that's what he had to paint. And it was scenes like this, I think, of Lambeth Pier that he had in mind, where you can see that sort of yellow dawn light as the sun comes up. And again, you've got this sort of curious mixture of a scene that is clearly a representational picture of the Thames and the boats on it and the riverbanks and the buildings. But it's also doing something else. One of the critics at the time said that if you look at any small detail in an Alfred Cohen picture, you have a gem of abstract painting. And you can see exactly what he means here. If you look here, say at this corner where you've got the buildings painted, it's very cubist looking. If you just framed that on its own, it would look like a cubist painting. But when you stand back and sort of half close your eyes, as Alfred said, you should do when you're getting a sense of the structure of a painting, then everything falls into place. In this picture here of Wapping Pier and Tower Bridge, you can see him getting really interested in the structures around the river, the piers, the docks, the cranes, the bridges. Tower Bridge, the famous iconic bridge, is very shadowy in the background, kind of dwarfed by this more industrial structure in the foreground. I think there's even a boat nestling in there although it's very hard to see. And again, it's that sense of moving from, the river that's a very familiar sight to all Londoners, to a sense of more abstract patterning going on in the painting that always interested him. The London paintings continue in this section here, and we've got two fantastic examples. On this side, there's Sunset from Blackfriars Bridge, where you can see a really fiery example of a sunset where the sun is illuminating the water in a way that makes the light look actually solid. It's like, as Sarah McDougall, my co-curator, says, it's as if the Thames is catching fire. Fantastic sort of energy and excitement in that painting, I think. But again, also very abstract, the way he's broken down the sunlight into these sort of blocks of light, as well as doing that with the buildings on the left. And then by contrast, if you have a look at the picture here, this is Docklands Night. Again, the interest in the river and the docks of London, but seen under totally different conditions. So dark you can hardly make out the dock structures. Just these twinkling little lights where perhaps people are still working or they've just lit them up for safety. You can see there are a couple of little red dots of light on top of those cranes. But in both cases, I think a very strong sense of the mood of the picture. This is much calmer and perhaps more melancholy, but again very evocative. And look how again he's simplified the palette so that this is almost entirely blue, but the intensities he gets out of that blue are really extraordinary. Often he does that with reds and oranges or purples, as he does in the Blackfriars Bridge one. So a very different mood of the Thames and Docklands, but still very powerful and evocative, I think. The London pictures end with this painting, Thames View 3, which, like many of them, give an aerial perspective on London. Alfred said, as having been an aerial navigator during the war, it was natural for him to get high up and look at the city from above. And there's a clipping here from a newspaper which described him as the Spider-Man painter because he got up onto tall buildings to get these high views of London. In 1962, Alfred changed galleries and moved to the Brook Street Gallery in London. And in 1963, they gave him his first solo exhibition there, and he decided to paint on the theme of the Commedia dell'Arte, the figures of Punch and Judy and Harlequin and Columbine and so on. And he did a lot of paintings on this theme, and it's a particular focus of this exhibition, in fact. Here you can see an example called Punch and Judy, where he's concentrated on the more kind of British version of that story, the Punch figure here, Punch and Judy together. They're in a sort of seaside Punch and Judy stall. And this is typical of some of his work in this period, where he'd break up a composition into different sections, and they were called multiples. A lot of artists were doing this. Sometimes Alfred would do it with landscapes, but more often with figures like this. So you can see another example of a Commedia dell'Arte multiple here. This is one of the drawings from that exhibition. But here you've got two figures from the Commedia dell'Arte, Columbine, the young woman, and the doctor, who are having an affair. And this is very much from the Italian and French traditions of the Commedia dell'Arte, which really fascinated Alfred. Some of the major Commedia dell'Arte paintings are the ones on this wall here, and I really think they're some of Alfred's masterpieces. They're incredibly powerful paintings. The three red ones are all of Punch figures, very different in mood and in posture. We have on the far right, the entrance of Punch coming in on his horseback. Rather ambiguous sort of gesture. He's possibly grinning, but also waving this truncheon over his head. So is it sort of celebratory or is it menacing? It's hard to tell. There's this very menacing figure in the center, Polichinelle Rex, sort of wielding his cudgel. And then a Punch on the left, with again a very ambiguous expression. Like so many of Alfred's Commedia dell'Arte figures, he's masked. And when you look closely, I think it's a half mask, so the chin is probably the real chin, but the top half of the face is the mask. But you can't always tell where the mask ends and the face begins, and that produces a very uncanny effect, especially when you see the eyes and the teeth and the kind of life they have. Of course, on a painting, all of these things are equally painted, so that's part of the uncanniness of the effect, I think. But then you also have these beautiful Columbine figures in between the Punches. Columbine number 1 over there, very sort of vivacious and voluptuous figure, and the entrance of Columbine on her horse sort of matching the entrance of Punch, here coming into the stage with great sort of energy and panache. Some viewers find these paintings, I think, quite disturbing, quite scary. They have such a range of moods, and it does include disturbing emotions of fear and betrayal and anger, rage, but also love, jealousy, and joy and excitement. They move people in different ways, but people usually are moved by them in some way. We moved to Kent in 1963, just after the Commedia dell'Arte exhibition. And Alfred found himself very captivated by the landscape of Kent. It's a very beautiful county, it's known as the Garden of England. And he loved that sense of the enclosedness of the villages and the hedgerows and the fields. And he tries to capture it in a lot of his paintings. And a lot of the paintings in that period were themselves very small. You know, having painted these enormous scenes of London and these great Commedia dell'Arte figures, he then starts painting very small-scale pictures like these beautiful ones here. This one is of the village Goudhurst that we first moved to. And you can see he's tried to capture that sense of the buildings all kind of crowded together on the way up the hillside. He loved the Channel coast and painted the British side as well as the French side. And you can see some beautiful examples here as well. This one on the bottom left is Rainbow off Tréport in France. He loved painting rainbows. Another example of his interest in the effects of light and water. In 1978, Alfred and Diana moved to Norfolk, where Alfred lived for the rest of his life. They bought a little schoolhouse in the village of Whiton near Wells next to the sea, and it made wonderful studio space for him. He was doing a lot of etching at that time, so one of the classrooms became the etching press, one became the painting studio. And the painting in this last period, particularly the last decade, very late 80s, early 90s onwards, becomes very bright and bold. The textures become much flatter and very heavily patterned. So this, for example, is typical. This is the Lifeboat Cafe in Cromer on the seafront. But you can see him sort of making patterns out of the windows and being fascinated by the writing in the windows and the signs and the shapes they make and so on. There's less of a kind of build-up of heavy textures of paint as you got in, say, those Kent landscapes from the 1960s. This painting here is of Wells Harbour, which was still a working port when they moved to Wells. And Alfred just loved that port and the kind of busyness of it, and he painted several versions of the harbour. And again, you can see the paintwork is quite flat. And again, it's sort of very geometrically patterned, and he's still as interested in colour as ever. In the last section of the exhibition, we've hung pictures not in chronological order, but thematically. And this section is called Framing and Abstracting the Landscape. And what we're trying to suggest here is that Alfred was always interested in how painters divide up their spaces and their canvases, how they make compositions and how they structure them. So here he's got a scene of a harbour, it's called Harbour Approach, but he's painted a border around it. There's this sort of white border painted on at the bottom, but then also a red and orange line there. He's even left some of the board exposed that the painting is painted on. So you've got this sense of multiple framing of the image. And it seems to me that one of the things he's doing is suggesting that this is not just a painting of a boat approaching a harbour, but it's a painting about how a painter approaches a painting of a harbour. And you can see Alfred doing similar things with paintings that actually have frames depicted in them. Take this picture of Dieppe, which has the window frame. You're looking out of a window and you get the wonderful view of the harbour, but it's then divided up by these verticals. So you've got the open sea out to the right, the very busy port here, and then the sort of busy harbour with all the traffic in the middle. And that sense of how a painter divides up the composition into three. It's a kind of triptych, but of a very modern and secular kind, I think. In the painting on the far right here, this is the Walmer lifeboat and the Goodwin Sands. The Goodwin Sands, a famous place where ships get wrecked off the Kent coast, and the lifeboat goes out to save them. And again, he's painted it as if it looks like it's painted through a window, But it could also be a multiple composition. We saw multiple compositions in the Commedia dell'Arte section of the exhibition, where he'd put several paintings in one frame. And here you've got the painting of the coast with buildings with the lifeboat, and then a rather different image of the sunset over the sea. And the fact that he's written the description of the subject there and his signature sort of over the painting, again, makes it unclear exactly whether we're looking at a framed object or something through a window. In this painting, the view from Peyremequis's studio, this records a visit to the Belgian painter Constant Peyremequis's home, which has been turned into a museum. And this is the landscape the studio was set in. So this could be a view, as seen out of the window in that studio of Peyremequis's. But it's also the view Alfred is taking on Peyremequis's world, because Peyremequis's paintings were very sort of dark and brown and full of earth colours. He'd never have painted a sunset like this with this bright red sort of Cohen trademark sky. And again, you can see that it's a rather abstracted painting, certainly in the sky area or in the foreground, although the middle section is still quite representational. You can see a little church and some people clustered in front of it even. So he's playing again with ideas of views and how artists frame views. In its last years, Alfred started producing completely different works, these very witty constructions made of all sorts of different objects that he found lying around. And they have a kind of curious quality that a lot of his other work doesn't always have. This one is called Cherbourg, 1949, and it's made 50 years after that date, very near the end of his life. And I think what he's doing in it is capturing the moment he first saw Europe. It uses an actual ship's porthole. He was sailing across the Atlantic on the Queen Elizabeth, and he remembered looking through the porthole of the cabin and seeing a little French tugboat. And so this French tug was his first sight of Europe. And I think that says a lot about why tugboats were so important. We saw an example of him painting tugboats earlier on in his career, but here he is right at the end of his career, of his life, looking back and remembering that moment. Another example is this one here called The Draftsman. And again, you can see Alfred looking back over his career. It's full of objects that draftsmen use, and I think particularly the kind of tools that he would have used when he was a commercial illustrator in Chicago right at the beginning of his career. All these kind of squares and curves for drawing very precise drawings. There's a pair of dividers, bits of a compass. And he's put them together and made an abstract composition, which is also very beautiful. He's painted the squares to make a sort of series of coloured shapes out of them. Jackie Klein writes beautifully about this in the book accompanying the exhibition, suggesting that these two forms might be a sort of reprise of the Commedia figures of Columbine and the Doctor, yet again kind of locked in an embrace. But I think you have a sense here that though he's carrying on making things and is as inventive and creative as ever, he's also perhaps saying goodbye to his tools if he realises that at some point he's going to have to lay them down. So there's a very poignant note, I think, or a sense of an ending here as well.